Welcome back to Wordy Wednesday. Well, last week and the week before, I got questions about allegories. Now, when we dealt with the overall definitions of metaphors, similes, analogies, idioms, allegories were on the list. This is, in fact, the notes that I used for that. And this little scribble down here is allegory. I saved my notes in case I need to go back to them. And I don't think we got into allegories at all. I think I just sort of wandered past that, gave you a lengthy definition of analogy, and for some reason skipped right over allegories. So we're going to talk about that today. To recap quickly, a simile is a head-to-head comparison. We know it's a direct comparison because we are using words like, as, than, beyond. Beyond is another one because I realized not all similes have those words, but they have words with similar meaning. Why beyond? Because when I was thinking of similes, I thought back to Psalms, and what was it? Who can find a virtuous woman? Her price is beyond rubies, or maybe it's above rubies. And that is a simile, even though it doesn't have like, as, than. It has the same concept. Head-to-head comparison. This is that. And we usually say it just in terms of John was as smart as a whip. I don't know why whips are considered smart. I would have to say that's a simile that is actually more idiomatic because a whip is not clever. So you see, there's that crossover. As quick as lightning, as sly as a fox. Some of them are just trite. They're just so commonplace. But again, as smart as a whip, that's idiomatic. So, can a simile be an idiom? Of course. Metaphor is when we use one concept to sort of conjure up another. It's not a head-to-head comparison. Metaphor is, for example, if we say we are fighting off a cold. Well, we're not literally boxing that cold. Our immune system is doing its job and attempting to thwart the incursion of this virus. Is it fighting? No, not in any sense we would recognize as literal combat or fisticuffs. More metaphorical. It's more abstracted. And then we get into analogies. An analogy is a little more involved than merely a metaphor because an analogy is used to explain. So if I did a video about getting the corks out of salt and pepper shakers, and I used my little pokey tool and I jammed it into the salt shaker and pulled out the cork. And I could say, for example, this is analogous, an analogy to pulling out the last bits of peanut butter from a jar. Poke, poke, dig, dig, pull out. Because it explains what I'm doing. So that's where an analogy is different. Now, I just gave you a very, very simple analogy. Most analogies are a little more complicated. People, last week I did a video about the rules men need to follow when they are shopping in the stores. And it is analogous to your car. You know, you wouldn't drive your car on the left side of the road, so you don't push your shopping cart on the left side of the aisle. It's an explanation. It's meant to further elucidate a point. You take something that someone knows, that they're very familiar with, apply it to the new situation, and you have an analogy. Now, to have a good analogy, it really has to be head on. You know, for example, bearing right with your shopping cart. I couldn't use, for example, parking your car, which can be a much, yes, you can come up, which can be a much more complicated procedure in a car than with a shopping cart, because even though in some limited circumstances it might be analogous, it isn't really. It's not a head-to-head analogy. So if I used it in terms of how to park your shopping cart, it would at best be a poor analogy. So how about allegories? Now, allegories are completely familiar to all of us, even if we don't know it. We grew up on allegories. Aesop's fables are allegories. It is a tale ostensibly about one thing. For example, sour grapes. The fox sees the grapes and can't get the grapes, walks away and says, I bet they were sour anyway. It's not about grapes. And sour grapes, by the way, is an idiom. So in order to be an idiom, as we know, it has to have penetrated our culture to the point where I say those two words, sour grapes, and it resonates with you, and you get this whole picture. And I don't have to explain the idiom any further than that. And that, by the way, is where the idiom sour grapes comes from, Aesop's fables. Now, Aesop lived 2,500 years ago. So we've had this stuff with us in our culture for a very long time. And when I say our culture, I'm talking about human culture. We all have this in our tales, our fables. We have allegories in the Bible. Little stories about one thing. Now, and they are coherent. They have a meaning on the surface. But with an allegory, it's meant to apply to other circumstances. We have this throughout medieval literature. It's Native American cultures have these incredible, fanciful, creative creation stories that are allegories. They have, Sky Mother coming down and getting the animals to help create the world. And then we have the two brothers, right brother and left brother. And it's hugely allegorical because they are intended to show many things, not just that simple creation story. The implications are very, very broad. And we've all used allegories. When you want your kid to set the table, you teach them the story of little Henny Penny. Remember her? And she wanted help when she planted her grain and nobody would help her. And she wanted help when she harvested the wheat and nobody would help her. And she wanted help to grind the grain. And if you had a creative mother, this story could go on for hours. And then eventually, who will help me eat the bread? And everybody's like, me, me, me. And what your mother is saying is not, go stick some feathers on your head and plant grain out in the garden. She's saying, if you want supper, you'll help me set the table. So we do this all the time. We do it with little children to teach them. And the world is full of this. Aesop's fables, the Arabian Nights stories, what was it? Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves is an allegory about greed and covetousness, and you can see all kinds of things in these stories. Medieval literature abounded in allegory. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is probably the classic one. The Green Knight is not really a knight. The Green Knight is it's man versus nature. And yeah, you can write a college paper on that, believe me. Yeah, I know people who've done it. So allegories are powerful teaching tools. And we're not going to discuss the biblical allegories. And the reason we're not going to is, even though a great many of us look at biblical stories and say, this is an allegory, some of us look at the Bible and say, no, every word of the Bible is literally true, and this literally happened. So that if I talk about the widow's mite, it's like, no, there really was a widow, there really was a mite, and I don't want to get into a religious dispute over this, even though I may see this as an allegorical story. Someone else may see this as a literal truth, and that's their religious point of view. And it is not my job here to redefine your religious point of view. So allegories are a common thread. And as I say, not just in our culture. In all cultures, there are allegories, and we can dig through any one of these. You could sit down with Aesop's fables or the Scheherazad's 1001 Arabian Nights tales and pull all kinds of messages and meanings out of them. A good allegory really lends itself to a wide variety of applications. Common allegories are things like the tortoise and the hare. All little children know that. Or how about the grasshopper and the ant? And the grasshopper is lazy and fiddles away all summer long, and the ant is gathering food for winter. And, the grasshopper is hungry in the winter, but the ant is well fed. We teach our children that. We're not teaching them about ants and grasshoppers. We're teaching them about forethought and preparedness. And when you are 5 years old, a story like that is teaching you, to take good care of your crayons and put them away so you'll know where they are later. And when you're 12 years old, it's teaching you to get your homework done on time. And when you're 20 years old, it's teaching you to save a little bit of your paycheck when you go out to work. So a good allegory is just, it's a beautiful thing. And our culture is just chock full of this. Not just our culture, as I say, everybody's culture is chock full of this. And I find that listening to the stories and tales of other cultures and their allegories is really interesting for me, because I end up, based on my own cultural reference points, pulling things out that a person from the culture where the allegory originated, they might not have ever looked at it from that point of view, because they have different cultural reference points. So If you think of an allegory as like a giant metaphor, this whole story usually doesn't have to be a long one. Grasshopper and the Ant, you can tell that story in about 30 seconds. Sour grapes, I think I just gave it to you in 2 sentences. Fox doesn't get the grapes and then walks away saying they must be sour. There you go. All of these stories, how do we tell the difference between an analogy and an allegory? Well, an allegory is more involved, and an analogy in general is not a story. Remember the analogy of driving the car is as being analogous to pushing the shopping cart. It's just a little concept you're grabbing from one set of circumstances and applying it to another set of circumstances. Quick, down and dirty, whereas your allegory is like a whole story. And by the way, if you're having trouble teaching hubby how to shop in the grocery store, I bet there are a whole bunch of allegories you can come up with, including things like stories from your own family circumstances. You know, remember the time when you wouldn't listen to me about painting the windowsill? Apply that to shopping. And by the way, the story about painting the windowsill can be as good an allegory as something that was written in the Bible or survived from medieval literature. It doesn't have to be a formal written story that, you know, you read in a book and refer back to. Allegories can come from every aspect of your daily life. What it needs is it needs to have a story that has one surface meaning, and then you apply it to another context and it has that other meaning where it is applied to the context you are now putting it in as a teaching tool. So hopefully this will have sorted it out. But remember, as I said before, huge amounts of overlap. Sour grapes is an idiom, you know, and you can turn an idiom into a metaphor, you can turn a metaphor into an idiom, etc. Lots of overlap. So just because you look at something and say, I'm not sure what this is, it might not be just one thing. It might be a simile. It might be an idiom as well. It might be a metaphor. If you spend a little time with it, you might be able to turn it into an analogy or an allegory. All of them, this is what they have in common. It is when we grab one set of circumstances that is familiar to our audience, and our audience is just whoever we're making our point to. One set of circumstances that that person or persons can relate to. You know it's in that picture book they carry around in their heads. And then you apply it to another set of circumstances that allows you to make your point quickly, cleanly, and convincingly, because you're going back to a reference point or a series of reference points that that person knows and fully understands. And Aesop's fables are great for that because everybody's heard them. They are so amazingly familiar to us, and we just throw them into other circumstances. In addition to being a teaching tool, this is also really useful when, especially if you're dealing with either a child who is not comprehending what you say or someone with whom you're having a, well, let's call it a discussion instead of an argument, someone with whom you're having a discussion and they're having trouble seeing your point of view. If you can use metaphors, analogies, allegories to pull them into your point of view. Just get them into a different set of circumstances, pull them out of the box they are in, and drop them into the little thought box you want them to be in. It can really help facilitate your communication. And ultimately, that's what these are all about. Communicating effectively. So, my challenge to you is, we're all word nerds. Take a look. Next time a metaphor pops into your head, next time you come across a simile or you think of an analogy or an allegory, take it and try to turn it into something else. The sour grapes. Like I said, that's an idiom. Find yourself another one and say, gee, is there an idiom I can pull out of this? Some idiomatic expression. And an idiomatic expression is just instant shorthand for an analogy or an allegory. See how many of these you can flip, because once you start thinking about it, you realize the interrelated nature of all of these concepts means that most of our metaphors can be turned into similes. Our similes can be turned into metaphors. We can draw back on our just that vast body of cultural knowledge we all have, link it back to an analogy or an allegory that we've heard somewhere else. And when you start doing that, when you become accustomed to making these relationships, you start seeing them everywhere. Your own thoughts become more clear. And as a result, your ability to communicate your thoughts to other people becomes a lot easier, a lot more clear. All right, so hopefully we have taken care of that one, which I should have taken care of before. And by the way, when one person doesn't get something, you can sit back and say, well, maybe they weren't paying attention. But when more than one person doesn't get something, you have to look back and say, gee, did I really explain that correctly? And that's what happened to me with this. Apparently, I did not explain it correctly. No such thing as bad students. There is such a thing as a bad teacher. So, my bad. Now, while I have your attention, C. White, Wanda Bassett, Terry Cover. These were all winners on our holiday giveaway, and I do need to hear from you folks because you have won prizes. So be sure to get your comment to me so that I can tell you what to do, how to get back to me. Also, if you've entered the holiday giveaway or any of the giveaways, click the notification bell on the video. That way, when I respond to your winning comment, you'll get a little notification saying something happened, and you can go back and look it up. All right. Have a terrific day, everyone. We will see you tomorrow night on Book Club, and we will be finishing up A Confederacy of Dunces. We'll be talking about our next selection, and I will see you all Friday morning.